morning. I got to do that. Pardon me. Oh, Nicole got that going for me. Okay, and there's the transcripts. And then you can also introduce yourself in the chat box. It's kind of nice to kind of hear all the different people that are here, so I appreciate that as well. And then I know Mary's going to have an opportunity for discussion as well. So welcome, and I appreciate it. Mary, it's all yours.
Great, thank you, Will. With that introduction, I think they now know more about me than I know about myself. But I appreciate that kind introduction, gives people a bit of a sense of my background. I want to welcome all of you who have joined us today. I looked at the list and we have quite a good number. I know more people have registered than have yet signed on, but I saw lots of local people from the Brazos Valley, from our local organizations and from the region. Which is great. We are delighted to have those of you who join us every time and some new ones as well. I saw a bunch of Bush School students, including some of my students and some of my former students, and I'm really happy to see you. And also some students and friends who have joined us from other places, from some of the places that I have been fortunate enough to engage with professionals and academics in other parts of the world. So thank you all for taking the time to join me and my colleagues from the center here today. I wish we could all be in a room together where we could really sit and talk and discuss the ideas and discuss our experiences. And of course, that's much more difficult on Zoom. But I still definitely want people to feel free to ask questions, to come in with comments. And I think I'm going to try to have a couple of different places throughout the presentation to give people the chance to do that. There's some sort of major sections, and at the end of each section, I'll try to get questions and see what discussion we have. So now I am going to share my screen, which will take just a moment. Okay. I was thinking I could get the full screen, but it's not doing that. It's still showing the side ones, but I guess everyone can see this, so this should work fine. Let me go back to my title slide. Adaptive leadership, leading an organization to face its difficult challenges. So adaptive leadership is a topic for today. And you probably noted in the introduction that Will gave that leadership is not something that I am an expert in. I'm not a scholar of leadership studies. This is not coming from my original work, but this is work about leadership that to me has been very meaningful. I believe it's very important. I teach it to my students, at least when I have the chance. I teach it to my students, and so I'm happy for those who are with us today and haven't had a chance to hear this, because I really think it's important. So I'm hoping that you'll go away from our session today with some new ideas and some skills and a commitment to really work on developing those skills and putting in practice some of these ideas. So the work that I am talking about, it really comes from a scholar of leadership, Ronald Heifetz, and he has the book Leadership Without Easy Answers, which is kind of the book that I'm primarily referring to and drawing on and interpreting as I put together this presentation. He has another book as well with Marty Linsky, a colleague, called Leadership on the Line, Staying Alive Through the Dangers of Leading. So I very much encourage, these books go much, much more deeply than this quick introduction I can give you to the ideas. So if you are interested and find this useful, I very much encourage you to go to these books and read them. They're actually quite readable. So three main topics that I want to cover today. First is talking about this concept of adaptive leadership and digging into that a little bit. Then the second is well, how do you do it? And the third is, how do you do it and keep going and survive? A little bit about how do you take care of yourself in doing this. So starting out thinking about the concept, the first thing is that in this approach, leadership is viewed as an activity. It's not about a position who's in, not about a position, and the idea that you're not talking about people as leaders, you're talking about people who exercise leadership. So the idea that this approach to leadership is different from many other approaches that may focus on people who are in positions that we think of as positions of leadership. But this is really looking at leadership as an activity, and also not a set of personal characteristics, not that there are certain people who are born leaders. This is something that is an activity that anybody can do. The second part of it is that it's viewed in terms of adaptive work. And what we mean by adaptive work is addressing conflicts in values people hold, or reducing the gap between the values and reality. So it's where an organization or a community has to make changes to be able to move forward, and it has to confront the things that are holding it back. It has to confront the gaps. It has to confront the problems and the conflicts. And so it's work that requires adaptation, and it's difficult work. The concept really relies on two sets of distinctions. One is between authority and leadership, and a second is between technical problems and adaptive problems. So I want to talk about each one of these. First, in terms of what do we mean when we talk about authority versus what do we mean when we talk about leadership. Authority, and we know people are in positions of authority. People have authority, and they're conferred that authority either kind of officially because they're in a particular position, or because they have the trust of the people who work with them, and that gives them authority. And it may be something that is habitual. It becomes normal that you defer to someone because, and accept that they have this authority. People who have authority in organizations or communities are expected to keep the organization running smoothly, to keep everybody happy, to keep everybody satisfied. Leadership in this conception is something very, very different. Leadership, first of all, can be exercised by anybody. It can be exercised by the person in authority, but it can be exercised by somebody else in the organization or the community. This isn't just, I'm talking mainly organization, but this is relevant within whatever kind of community that you're thinking of as being a part of. It's focused on challenging an organization or community to face its problems. So instead of satisfying people, you're generally not making them very happy because you're asking them to face difficult problems. And in contrast with many views of leadership, it's not about setting a vision and mobilizing people to follow your vision. It's really helping an organization or a community figure out the problems that need to be addressed and how to address them and how to do it themselves. So it's not leading people with people behind you, it's helping your people to move forward on their own. The second distinction between technical and adaptive challenges and problems, or you can think of technical problems, adaptive problems. Technical problems are, you know what to do. You know how to solve a problem, and you can apply expertise to a problem. So someone breaks a leg, a doctor knows how to fix that. Someone has a particular disease that we know how to treat. The expertise can be applied. An organization has a problem, maybe it lacks somebody with a particular skill. You know how to do that. You can hire the person who can fill that gap. Adaptive challenges are different. You don't know how to solve the problem. You may not even fully understand what the problem is. It may involve a lot of different people or a lot of different groups. And solving it involves dealing with conflict, with values, with behaviors. So you can't just apply, you can't just, there's not expertise that you have that you can directly apply to it. Now, I would say this isn't always cut and dried. Many problems have aspects of them that are technical and aspects that are adaptive. So you can have a mix, but the idea that, that there are problems that are technical and problems that are adaptive is the important concept. Then the question is, well, why does this matter? It matters because adaptive challenges require different responses than technical challenges. If you think that you can just come in and say, oh, this is the problem, do this, or we will do this, and it's fixed, you know, it is probably not going to work when you're talking about people's values and conflicts over those values, big problems that are difficult in an organization. You can't just come in and say, this is how we're going to do it. So it's important, because if you don't think in advance about what kind of problem you're dealing with and how you need to address it, you may actually take a strategy that doesn't work for it. I think it's also important because a lot of the kinds of challenges that confront organizations are in fact adaptive. You all have been in organizations, are in organizations, you know how complicated things are and how you're dealing with many different people and many different aspects and many different values. And a lot of those, and you're dealing with an environment that changes. All of those things are characteristics that tend to make a lot of the problems that we deal with of the adaptive sort. I would say that authority can be a resource for leadership. So going back to this difference between authority and leadership, authority can be a resource for leadership because it can help you at points along the way to frame the problem for people, to get their attention. But it can also be a constraint, this idea that people want the authority figures in their organizations to keep things moving smoothly, and instead you're challenging them to confront difficult problems and maybe causing conflict. And in that respect, sometimes authority can actually be a constraint in trying to deal with adaptive challenges. So, just to define things, and here I'm actually using Heifetz's words. He defines an adaptive challenge as a gap between the shared values that people hold and the realities of their lives, or a conflict among people in a community over values or strategies. And so leadership, in this sense of adaptive leadership, is helping a community or an organization take on adaptive problems. It may be confronting conflicts within the community that are holding it back. It may be helping an organization realize that things have changed and that the way they've been doing things doesn't work anymore, and that they have to change to be able to face a new reality. There may be gaps between what you value and what you're actually doing, and how you bridge that, how you make the difference between the regular way you're used to doing things and what you're really trying to do. All of these things require change in mindsets and behaviors. And that's really why it's so difficult, because you're really trying to get people in your organization to change how they think about things and to change how they behave and how they interact with one another. I mean, all of this depends on the particular circumstance. But as I think now about the kinds of problems, the kinds of challenges that organizations are facing in our world in July of 2020, with so many changes, so many things happening around us, of course, the coronavirus situation, the amazing widespread demand for more social justice and more racial justice in the society, gender issues as well. A lot of things are coming together that are causing us to need to rethink how we do things within our organizations. These are very much adaptive problems. They're not always, when we talk about these kinds of things and needing leadership to help an organization move forward, it's not always about these big social changes. It may be about just something that's happening in the organization, that there are people who are unhappy because they're not treated well. There's something about the dynamics in the organization that hold it back from being able to do its best work. So it all depends on the individual situation. But I'd like to, so here's a point at which I'd like to take a break a little bit and let you ask questions if you have them, and also pose a couple of questions that I'm very happy to get comments and input on. One, do you find this distinction between technical and adaptive challenges helpful? Is it new? Is it helpful, not helpful? And secondly, thinking about your own situation and your own organization, do you see your organization facing adaptive challenges now, and what are they, and what is it that is making them, and why do you see them as adaptive challenges? Getting some examples out there. I tried to give a couple, but I'd love to hear some real examples from people about the kinds of changes and the kinds of challenges you're seeing as you're trying to move organizations or communities forward. So Will, I don't know if you've seen, if there have been any questions posed, or if you have anyone who's trying to get in, but I'm happy to have some input here.
Let me just chime in real quick. There's a question from Mary Pearl on the chat, so I'll just let her explain it or ask it.
Okay, great.
Yeah, thank you, Kenny. On the previous slide, you mentioned that sometimes for bridging that gap, there's a situation where you'll have to bridge from that what you value as an organization to what you want to accomplish or what you're actually doing. I almost feel like that is a scenario that we're seeing right now in the organization that I help to manage. Can you talk a little bit more about how you bridge that gap, or other examples that you've seen in ways that you've seen that an adaptive leadership model has helped to get from one point to the other point?
Well, I think so. As we go forward in this discussion, I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the ways that you try to do this. But I mean, I think you're right about it being the sort of thing that we're facing now. When I think about, so I'm obviously at Texas A&M University, and as a university, we're dealing with a lot of things where we realize, as I think about the diversity and inclusion issues, we value as a university and as the professors in the university, we absolutely value and have always valued diversity and inclusion and justice. But we also recognize are being forced to grapple with the fact that what we do doesn't always actually match what we value. So how do we, so the problem for us is really, there are larger forces in the society, but they're replicated within individual organizations where we need to be able to confront them and find ways to move forward. And, you know, there aren't any easy answers, but like I said, I'll be going forward and talking a bit more about this, but, you know, really talking with the different people who are involved and the different people who have different perspectives, and trying to find ways to get people to understand one another, as I think about some of these difficult situations that we're dealing with right now. But there are some specific skills that I want to talk about. But so I haven't really answered your question about how.
No, but you gave me a great idea. I mean, that's basically, it's a values reassessment point where you're looking at the shifting perspectives of your organizational values and how you're going to adapt those into this changing model of what you're physically doing as an organization. I think that was kind of the summary of what you just answered.
Yeah, okay. You know, and I think when we think about nonprofit organizations, we tend to fall back on the idea of the mission of guiding what we do. And that's really important, but it's not as if there aren't different aspects to even if you have a clear mission, and even if you're communicating it well across all of your staff and across all of the levels, and you're using it the way you're supposed to use it, different people may interpret it differently. It may have to change over time. So in some ways, I think when you're thinking about nonprofits, there can be a gap between your mission definition and what different people in the organization value, that you still need to grapple with, that it's not just, we're going to do this is what we stand for, we're going to do it, let's move forward. It actually takes more negotiation about all of those things, right, than just easy steps forward. So trying to put it a little bit in the context of nonprofit organizations and how we tend to think about some of these issues about values. Any other comments or questions before we move forward? No, you're not, Kenny and Will, you're not seeing anything else to jump in?
Yeah, I've got one other that just chimed in, and anyone, I guess Mary or feel free. It's a scenario that asks, Josh leads a small nonprofit organization that serves the urban immigrant poor. And in this season of so much economic uncertainty, would you recommend expanding or contracting services? And so I guess the question is if they expand, unique ways to resource that expansion.
Yeah, so it seems to me that the kind of choice you're facing is an adaptive challenge. So I couldn't answer that from the outside. That's the sort of thing that within both the people in your organization, but also the people out that you serve, you know, working with people to figure out what does make best, what is what we should do, and how are we going to do it. Those are, and to some extent that parts of that may become a technical problem, because then once you decide kind of how you're going, what you need to do, and how you're going to do it internally, you do have some things about how do you get resources and how do you make this work. That may have technical and adaptive characteristics, but I think the main point really in response to the question is that challenge is in itself an adaptive challenge that you then have to figure out how to work with in your organization, that there's not a clear answer to. Okay, so let me go back to I would challenge you to keep thinking about these questions, about the difference between technical and adaptive challenges, and within your organization, what are the challenges that you have right now that you would think of as adaptive, and then that will give you something to begin to work with later on. Okay, let me go forward then. So the next part is really, okay, how do you do this? How do you exercise adaptive leadership? There's not some rule book or recipe book for doing this. These are complex problems, but there are some key practices that help. And again, these are drawing directly on the kind of outline of ideas that Heifetz suggests. One of the absolute key ideas is getting on the balcony. I'm going to come back and talk about each one of these. Identifying the adaptive challenges, managing distress, focusing attention on the problem, and giving the work back to the members of the community or the organization. Getting on the balcony is a metaphor that I think can be really powerful. And I know when I taught this last semester to my students, some of them were thinking that I meant like the Pope or the Queen getting on the balcony and addressing the crowds. It's not, that's the wrong balcony, the wrong balcony and the wrong people. The metaphor is the dance floor. Think of a dance floor filled with people dancing, moving around the floor. If you're in that mix, you can only see the people right around you. You can't see the big picture. So the idea is that if you go up on the balcony, you can look down and you can see the patterns. You can see how people are relating to one another. You can see how it moves around the room. And so that's the metaphor here. The idea of the dance floor and the balcony above the dance floor to give you a broader perspective and to give you an overall perspective of what's happening in the organization, because you can't, when you're in the middle of it, you can't see that. You have to find ways to see it. And so really most of the things I'm going to be talking about in the rest of this section are ways to help you do that. Since we can't physically get up on a balcony and see how the organization is working, you have to, the idea is how do you actually do that in the real organization? You want to be able to diagnose the challenge, and you want to analyze how you can get people to face it. So identifying the adaptive challenge, what needs to change, and why and how is really the first part. You know, you recognize that there's a problem, but you don't know from the beginning how, you don't understand the problem well enough to know how to address it. So there's a set of questions that can be helpful in trying to sort out what the problem is, what the challenge is. What's causing the distress in the organization? What contradictions does that represent? I mean, essentially what's behind the stress and the distress in the organization? Where does it come? What's the history of this? It's not usually if there are problems, they probably aren't just, I mean, some challenges emerge out of a changing context, but many challenges emerge gradually out of the history of an organization and people's work in the organization. And then it's also important to think about how you yourself are perceived, how you're seen, what side you're seen on, how you're perceived as having an interest in this, and how other players are perceived, so that you're trying to understand the challenge as deeply as possible. The next thing, the next point is about managing distress, and one of the key arguments is really that to move forward, when you have a difficult situation, a difficult problem that involves people's values and conflicts, to get people to face it actually means bringing about greater distress in some ways, or maybe bringing about different distress. But people don't, you know, we know from behavioral psychology and economics that loss is, we don't like loss. We overvalue loss compared to the benefits we get from things. It can be very difficult to be able to change behaviors and change mindsets. You have to actually confront things. And so that in itself, the process of adaptive leadership, of helping an organization face its problems when they're around these kinds of issues, creates distress in the organization. And you need that because you can't move forward without it. That's what allows you to move forward, but you have to manage it and contain it. So you have to be able to do that. You have to understand how does it come out? How do we see it? How do people respond to it? What's the history of problem solving in the organization? So some of the things to ask: what do you see in the organization when there is stress and conflict? How does it play out? How does it looking back in the past, how has it become self-destructive? What do you need to make sure that you're preventing? What have been successes in the past? What have people done to manage it that would be helpful? And what mechanisms do you have in your position to be able to manage the stress and the conflict? Another point is the importance of keeping attention focused on the problem. You know, when we don't like facing hard problems, and so we often try to avoid them. We try to avoid them in a lot of different ways by finding somebody to blame. You know, there may be somebody in the organization that ends up getting blamed for a problem, or find excuses for why it happens. Another response may be you keep reorganizing. If we reorganize, everything will be fine. We'll solve the problem just by reorganizing. Or just turning aside to other problems. There are an organization faces lots of different problems at any time. And so if it's hard to focus on what you're trying to solve, it may be easier to say, oh, let's not do that. Let's go think about these other things. So part of the exercise of leadership in this situation is to keep people focused on the problem, and understand how you can do that. So the questions to ask: how do people in the organization tend to work on problems, or how do they avoid that work? What do you know about how people try to skirt around the work? What do I see currently about work avoidance that tells me about, what does that tell me about the nature of the challenge we're facing right now? And then also, since there are lots of different problems, you kind of have to make sure you're choosing a problem that the term Heifetz uses is ripe for addressing. What is it that you can actually take on now and keep people's attention focused on, as opposed to all of the other problems? So as you can see, none of these things they're not cut and dried. They're not answers to how you do it, but they're ways to help you make sure that you're thinking about the right things as you're going about trying to help the organization. Then the other thing is giving the work back to your people. There can be a real tendency, and I know this personally perfectly well, that when things are difficult, it may be just easier to say, oh, I'll take care of it, I'll do something. And people want you to do that. The people in the organization, if you're the one who's in authority, especially, and trying to get changes, they would rather that you just did something to take care of it, rather than really continuing to get people to work on it and to make the kinds of changes that they need to make. So don't be tempted to let the organization depend on you to make the changes. Figure out what different kinds of changes individual people in the organization need to be able to make to help the whole unit move forward. And because these things are likely to cause conflict, it may mean orchestrating conflict. So questions to ask, the kind of cues, are changes in whose values, beliefs, or behaviors would allow progress on these issues? What are the losses involved? And given my role, how am I likely to be drawn into avoiding work? So being very self-reflective on this. So just those are really the set of guidelines, getting on the balcony and then to do that, identifying the adaptive challenges, managing distress, focusing attention on the problem, giving the work back to the members of the organization or the community. Again, it's not a recipe book. They're guidelines for how to think about and how to analyze and how to approach a problem. So can I comments or questions? Because I know it probably raises more questions than it answers. Anything coming? Anyone want to comment or to ask a question?
Encourage folks, if they got something, go on ahead and chime in or put something in the chat box. Kenny's tracking that as well as I.
I know that these kinds of things, these kinds of recommendations are difficult because as you think about, if you're dealing with a problem where people have very strong differences, I mean, along with some of the kinds of things that we're dealing with now, managing that conflict is not easy. And so this isn't telling you, how do you manage the conflict? It's sort of saying you're going to have to manage conflict, and you can use these various analytical techniques to help know what you need to do and to help you figure out what to do it, but it doesn't tell you how to do it.
Mary,
I was
it's
thinking,
Deborah.
Mary Pearl made the comment too about, sort of avoiding stuff. I watch this in a lot of different groups that I'm a part of, right, where the agenda continues to seem to shift almost on a weekly basis. And I'm sure that's a kind of a common thing I think a lot of nonprofits must confront. Like any thoughts on how you help keep focused in on a problem or the definition of the problem when a new one seems to arise almost every day?
Yeah.
For
Well,
us,
Donna, did you want to?
we're currently undertaking a study at Angelina College about guiding and directing change. There, of course, in education, there are so many changes, and we are also undergoing a computer conversion and lots of other things too.
yeah.
So we've got many, many changes, and but what I'm seeing that is working the best is intentional education with the managers of each department on how to manage the change by first creating awareness throughout all employees that there is a need for change. And of course, right now in secondary education, that's relatively easy because we're all looking at registration numbers and trying to maintain those when we are losing many of our tools like face-to-face classes and mentoring and that kind of thing. So, but I'm also seeing this in a couple of nonprofits that I'm working with. I work alongside executive directors, and their world has changed so much, and in their organizations as a whole, whether they offer classes or skill training or resources or food distribution, because their volunteers are evaporating and they only have so many paid staff, and their job descriptions are being expanded, plus the whole overriding COVID concern in the workplace. But what I have seen that is the most important feature of leading change is capitalizing on all of the relationships that have been built with the influence centers within the organization, not only to use them to help increase awareness, but for change and the need for change, but the real desire in staff to change, because people are so reluctant and resistant to any change. That's just our human nature. How is it going to affect me? And so one-on-one conversations leadership doing a lot of listening so you can get to that core reason for change resistance with your influence centers, and then teaching them how to push it down to all the folks that they give leadership to.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense, and I think it's consistent with this, because certainly the idea that you've got to work with the people in your organization or your community, you know, or your country, whatever level you're talking about, to really sort out what's the problem and how can we move forward together. And that involves a lot of listening. And you're right, being figuring out who do you need, who can exercise influence within the organization, who has trust, who do we need to bring along at different levels. So this is not, I think this process is a very gradual, where normally I think is a gradual process. And one of the examples that Heifetz uses he uses both some medical examples, because he has a medical and psychiatrist background in psychology, psychiatry, medicine, as well as academia and policy issues. So he has examples in his book from the medical field, as well as from politics and policy debates. But there's one story that I think is useful, that is about a doctor. So this is not an organization, but a family, a doctor dealing with a patient who has a diagnosis of cancer that he's not going to survive very long from. And so it's her working with the family to help them realize what's happening and think about how they need to change. And it's a very step-by-step process of how she manages both how much information she gives them at any given time to kind of help them make a gradual process and come to an acceptance, and then being able to take action to really organize the family the way they need to and take care of the things that they need to do. And so although that's a different kind of thing, the idea within an organization that it's something, it is stepwise. The managing distress means that you kind of have to push people or pull people along at a rate that they can tolerate. You can't just suddenly expect them all to change. It's not going to happen. So I think that's a good example. And yes, everybody in education is certainly facing, whatever level of education you're talking about right now, everybody's facing a lot of need to make changes that are clearly going to be difficult. So,
Mary, I'd like to just add, and this addresses Donna's point as well, that change is not a means to an end. We're not looking for a getting to a certain destination.
right.
It's a journey, and it has to be fluid, just like all of us dealing with this pandemic. We're seeing changes every day, not only in our service delivery, but also in managing our staffs. And how are we engaging them? How are we encouraging them?
Yeah.
And I think in a simplistic view, it goes back to our values. You know, is our vision and our mission, is our core values aligned with our vision and our mission? And are we demonstrating that on a daily basis? It's really a like you say with the balcony, it's a holistic approach to what we're doing, what's expected of us in the nonprofit world, and how are we demonstrating the value of what we're doing. When you're talking about changes, for your organization to follow through and change, because it is so difficult, your people have to see that there's value associated with that change. You've always done it a certain way, you're always going to get the same results. That change has to be a positive change.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. This isn't the kind of change that's to get you a particular goal. This is about defining your values and being able to move forward in ways that are consistent with what you value, and bringing your organization as a whole together and dealing with conflicts in the organization that hold you back. So yeah, you're right. It's a bigger process that's about the organization and the community and how you deal with problems, but it's not about how do we reach this particular goal. That's a very different kind of approach. Okay, thank you. I appreciate the comments that people have made and the questions.
Hey, Mary, I might jump in
Yeah,
just real
please.
quick, if you don't mind. So Dr. Bruce joined us and says she had a surgery, and she's certainly typing away. But one of the concepts that might be useful, since she mentioned it, is talking about how some of these concepts of adaptive leadership, might apply at different size organizations, or depending on what life cycle they're in. And one of the things, being familiar with some of the audience that's joined us today, is we're surely quite aware there's a variety of size organizations on the conference today. And I think what we tend to promote at the center is, regardless of size of your organization, and, academic literature, backs some of this up as well. In relation to, the concept of adaptive leadership, really what we need to keep in mind is we talk about where you started in terms of leaders having the responsibility to grow professionally. And one way or the other, regardless of the size of your organization, if you are in the leader role, there's just things that you have to do. It may even go back to one of the questions from a little earlier from Josh. There's some things, if we hold the position, that we have to do or should be doing operating in times like these. Our staff, they require us or call on us or look to us to make sense of what's going on. All of those critical decision-making pieces that have to happen at organizations, we're responsible for. So how do we as leaders, adapt to that? Yes, it may be different based on the size of organization, but one way or the other, we still have that personal responsibility. How do we orchestrate when we need to, whether it be internally at our organizations or out in the community? So one way or the other, I guess, since Dr. Bruce brought this up, and I know that we have a variety of size organizations on the call today, is that personal responsibility that we have as leaders to be innovative and figure it out. That's a responsibility that leaders have one way or the other. And so how do we do that? It's, keep grinding away. Josh, to your question from earlier, even though we hold a certain role, how do we get other ambassadors around our organizations to help carry that forward? That could be within your staff, and that could also be at the board level. That could be members from your community. It doesn't have to feel like a lonely position to get through times like this, but we have to be the ones responsible for orchestrating and making sense out of this stuff, again, whether internally or external to the communities that we operate in.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Kenny. I think the kinds of things you're discussing are a mix of the authority role and the leadership role, because as someone who is in the position of authority within an organization, does have all those responsibilities, and in this situation where a lot of things are changing, also needs to play a leadership role in helping the organization to deal with the changes. One thing I would comment about this particular approach is that I've mainly been talking about it in terms of how a person who is in an authority position or in an organization exercises leadership, but anybody can exercise leadership from any place in the organization. You can be in an organization and understand and see that there's a problem that needs to be dealt with, that's not being dealt with. And you can take the initiative to help to follow these kinds of steps and think about, okay, how can I, from whatever my position is in the organization, make a difference in helping the organization and helping my colleagues in the organization to make the kinds of changes that we need to make. So these approaches, I think that's one reason I like this, because I think it's helpful for people who are in authority roles, but it's also helpful for all of us And I think about this with my students, because I really want them to be the people who go out into their organizations and who will take the initiative to identify things that need to be improved, to be able to help the organization move forward, and to be able to put themselves on the line to try to make those changes happen. And so let me move forward. We don't have a lot of time left, and I will just do this quickly, but that makes the point. Leadership is hard. Whether you're doing the kind of leadership we're talking about here, where you're really helping an organization confront difficult problems, it's hard and it's risky. And by putting yourself out, especially if you're not in an authority position, but even if you are in an authority position where instead of keeping everybody happy, you're going to challenge them. So how do you survive? And as I noticed, the second book that I referred to as something like Staying Alive Through the Dangers of Leadership, they really emphasize that. So a number of different things to suggest. The first one, separating yourself from your role. So understanding that when people respond to you, they're responding not to you personally. They're not reacting to you as a person, but reacting to the role that you're in and the role you're playing in this leadership exercise. And being able to say that, to say, you know, okay, they're not angry with me as a person, they're angry with me as taking this leadership role, allows you to avoid internalizing the conflicts and staying out of the conflicts. Another suggestion they make is the importance of finding partners. And they talk about two kinds of partners. The confidant, who is somebody that you can just talk to. It may be a spouse, it may be a friend, it could be a colleague, likely someone outside of the organization, but somebody that you can go home to or go to as a friend and talk about how difficult things are, let off steam, but also get their perspective, get their completely independent perspective on how things are going. But you also need allies. You need allies. It may be across different parts of the organization or different organizations, depending on what level or what size you're working at. It may be across, this is supposed to say across different levels. If you're at a top level, you need to have allies farther down in the organization. Or if you're working from a lower level, you need to find allies up higher who will help you work. It's also really important to listen to yourself and to understand that your own reactions to things can help you understand better how you're leading and how you're operating and how you can improve. So you want to understand, want to know yourself. What are your own biases? How do you process information? How do you react? Think regularly about, what did I do that worked well and what did I do that didn't work well? And what does that mean? Then what do I need to do going forward? So learn from your successes and failures. And that really is a reflective practice. And then this I think is really interesting. And they suggested, or Heifetz suggests this, and I add this because it makes me laugh kind of. But talks about when you find people, there may be somebody who's always in a meeting who annoys you to death, and you just want to dismiss that person and not deal with them. And that's the sort of standard reaction. But they're saying, you know, if you're annoyed by something, that's some kind of signal of something that's happening in the organization, something of your reaction. Think deeper about it. So use being annoyed with somebody as a clue that there's something you need to understand better than you do. I just kind of like that idea. They recommend finding a sanctuary, that it's important. This is hard. This, as you all know, working in organizations, it's important not to lose yourself. And so you need to have some way to get away from it. So it's different for everybody else. It may be meditation, it may be bicycling or running, it may be just time apart, but that's really important to look for. And then to keep in mind that you have a larger sense of purpose. It's not just about this particular problem, which may get solved or may not get solved. There are frustrations along the way, even if it does. But you can keep perspective because you realize that you have larger values that you are really pursuing. So key takeaways, we're right at the ending time. Just to repeat a little bit, adaptive challenges, the concept, technical versus adaptive problems, the concept of getting on the balcony, which I hope people really will take away from this. Making sure that you're going deep in trying to understand the problems, asking why and how, looking into yourself, and then taking care of yourself. And so my challenge to you as you're going away, and I'm sorry we haven't had more time for discussion, but the question I asked before, does your organization face adaptive challenges? Do you see some of these ideas as helpful to you in your organization or community? And then how can you put into practice some of what you've learned today? And again, I recommend digging deeper into these ideas if you have an opportunity. But I thank you very much for thinking with me about these things and for the comments that have been made and the questions. I want to highlight the next upcoming webinar with my colleague, Ellie Chu. Is going to be talking about building a financial resilience through a crisis. Will, I know the time, we're right at the time, so I don't know if you want to allow another minute.
I think, you've wrapped it up. I appreciate it. We'll stay on if anybody wants to chat or wants to discuss stuff. I mean, this is a good one potentially to share with staff. So remember, it will be posted online. And I think because you posed so many really good questions in there, I think this would be a really good one to encourage some of your staff, folks who've got folks that might enjoy looking at this. I think there's some really good points in there. And so this will be posted probably, it usually takes us about a week or so to get this posted online. I mean, Mary, if you've got a few minutes, we can stay around for questions, and I'm going to stop the recording, I think. And